Now, the big question is, are we at the top of the interest rate rising cycle here in the UK from the Bank of England? Well, much depends on a number of factors, many of which are just nothing to do with what we're doing here in the UK. So they're beyond the shores. So when the governor of the Bank of England got up yesterday to suggest that he thought that we were far nearer the top of the cycle than not, this is his quote, he was saying, he said, I'm not therefore saying we are at the top of the cycle because we've got a meeting to come. Now, my interpretation of this was that there is little clarity on this. And I have to say that Andrew Bailey, in my recollection, has a track record of being unclear on some of his messaging. There is a tendency these days for central banks and governors of central banks to be as transparent as possible. But I don't think Andrew Bailey, as obviously intelligent as he is, has the gift of imparting precisely what he is thinking or what he really wants to say. And more often than not, he seems to leave people with some real problems. Let's take a look at this chart here. This is sterling against the US dollar. In yesterday's trade, we saw another leg lower for sterling against the US dollar. The markets took on face value what he was saying. And indeed, it may yet come to pass that there may not be any more interest rate rises, but there may be another one at the next meeting. But then what happens? Well, much of what happens, I think, here will depend on oil prices. So inflation, as I say, pretty much outside the control of what's happening with the Bank of England. This is sterling against the euro, down heavily in yesterday's session. But I think for me, one of the points about all this is what happens with this rise in the price of oil. Well, clearly, this will have an impact on inflation. And this is something the Bank of England has absolutely no control over. It does have a currency effect on all this. And what happens to sterling does make it more difficult. If sterling rises, it becomes more of an inflationary factor. If sterling falls, the price of oil falls against sterling in the currency. So there is an effect on the currency markets on inflation and on the oil price particularly. But oil is a big factor in our economies. So long as this is rising, I think inflation will at least stay where it is, which will mean the Bank of England will hold rates at highs for longer. And I think that is going to be a real problem. And the Bank of England has raised rates at each of its last 14 meetings. It's expected to raise borrowing costs again later this month, taking the bank rate to 5.5%.